The whole thing started at a wedding. Someone forgot to invite one goddess. She showed up anyway and threw a golden apple into the party. And 10 years later, 100,000 men were dead, an entire city was ash, and a woman history would remember as the most beautiful face ever born had been used as a bargaining chip by everyone around her. The Trojan War is preserved primarily in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, composed around the 8th century BCE. The Iliad focuses on the war's 10th year, while the Odyssey follows one hero's struggle to get home afterward. Together they form the most complete war literature the ancient world produced. What the Greeks were really doing with this story was examining war itself. The heroes are genuinely impressive and also genuinely terrible. The gods are capricious and petty. The causes are disproportionate to the consequences. That's not a mistake in the storytelling, that's exactly the point. If you want the full Greek mythology series, subscribe to Snap Old Myths and hit the bell. Like this video if you want more, and let's get into how 10 years of war began with one golden apple. The wedding was the marriage of the sea nymph Thetis and the mortal king Peleus. All the gods were invited except Eris, the goddess of discord. She arrived uninvited and threw a golden apple onto the table, inscribed with the words, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Zeus refused to judge between them, which is the correct decision. Nobody wins that argument if a god decides it. He passed the job to a mortal prince named Paris, who was living as a shepherd on Mount Ida near Troy, having been abandoned there because a prophecy said he would bring ruin to his city. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris and each offered a bribe. Hera offered power, Athena offered wisdom and skill in battle. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris chose Aphrodite. This made him a mortal enemy of both Hera and Athena, who would spend the next decade working to destroy him and Troy. There is one enormous problem with Aphrodite's prize. The most beautiful woman in the world is Helen of Sparta, and she is already married. Her husband is Menelaus, king of Sparta. When Paris arrives in Sparta as a guest and Helen leaves with him, Menelaus calls in every favor in Greece. Before marrying Menelaus, Helen had been courted by virtually every king in Greece. Her father made every suitor swear an oath they would all defend whoever won Helen against any wrong done to him. This was the oath of Tyndareus, and Menelaus now called it in. Not everyone was thrilled about this. Odysseus had recently married and had a newborn son. When the summons arrived, he pretended to be insane, plowing his fields with mismatched animals and sowing salt. The envoys tested him by placing his baby in the plow's path. Odysseus swerved. He'd outsmarted almost everything, but he couldn't outsmart fatherhood. The Greeks also needed Achilles, whose mother had hidden him among the daughters of King Lycomedes disguised as a girl. Odysseus found him by spreading out both jewelry and weapons. The one who grabbed the sword was Achilles. Over 1,000 ships assembled at Aulis, but the wind stopped. The goddess Artemis was holding them, and she would not release them until Agamemnon sacrificed his eldest daughter Iphigenia. Agamemnon lured his daughter there under the pretext of marrying her to Achilles. What awaited her was an altar. The fleet sailed. The war lasted 10 years. For the first 9, neither side could achieve decisive victory. Troy was extraordinarily well fortified, and the Trojans were led by Hector, Paris's older brother, a man whose courage and decency made him more sympathetic than almost any Greek hero. The Greeks are also, it has to be said, fighting each other. The Iliad begins in the 10th year with Achilles and Agamemnon in a furious dispute over a captive woman. Agamemnon took Briseis from Achilles. Achilles withdrew from the fighting entirely and asked Zeus to let the Trojans start winning, which Zeus does. With Achilles gone, the Trojans pushed hard. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, convinced Achilles to lend him his armor. The sight of Achilles' armor would shock the Trojans and push them back. Achilles agreed but gave strict instructions: drive them from the ships, then stop. Patroclus drove the Trojans back exactly as planned. Then he kept going. He pushed toward Troy's walls, directly against orders. Apollo struck him. Euphorbus wounded him. Hector delivered the killing blow. When the news reached Achilles, the grief was total. Achilles returned to the fighting, but what came back was grief made into violence. His divine mother arranged for new armor from Hephaestus overnight. Achilles swept through the Trojan forces like a force of nature, driving men into the river in such numbers that the river god rose against him in fury. But what he really wants is Hector. When they meet outside Troy's walls, everyone stops. Hector, for one terrible moment, breaks and runs, and Achilles chases him around the entire city 3 times. Hector finally stops and turns to face him. He knows he is going to die. He faces it anyway. Achilles kills Hector, then ties his body to his chariot and drags it around Troy's walls for days, in full view of Hector's family. He does this repeatedly, for 12 days. The gods watch and find it grotesque. Achilles has crossed a line. What finally breaks through is King Priam arriving alone in Achilles' tent at night to beg for his son's body. He kneels before the man who killed Hector and kisses his hands. Achilles looks at this old man and sees his own father. They weep together. Achilles agrees to return the body. It is the Iliad's most human moment. The Iliad ends before the war does. After Hector's funeral, several major events remain. The Amazon queen Penthesilea arrived to fight for Troy and was killed by Achilles, who wept when he saw her face. The Ethiopian warrior Memnon was also killed by Achilles in battle, and then Paris, guided by Apollo, fired an arrow that found Achilles' heel. The heel thing is actually stranger than people remember. When Achilles was an infant, his mother dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable. She held him by one heel, that heel never touched the water. One heel, one arrow, and the greatest warrior died. Without Achilles, and with the walls still unbreached, the Greeks turned to their cleverest mind, Odysseus. His solution was the Trojan horse. The Greeks built an enormous wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to conceal warriors. The bulk of the fleet then sailed away, making it appear the siege was over. They left the horse with a Greek spy who told the Trojans it was a sacred offering to Athena, designed too large to fit through the gates. The Trojans debated. The priest Lokun warned them he feared Greeks bearing gifts and hurled a spear at the horse. Poseidon sent to sea serpents to kill Lokun and his sons, which the Trojans took as punishment for doubting a sacred offering. Cassandra told them exactly what was inside. Nobody listened. The horse was brought inside. Troy celebrated. The Greeks inside waited until the city slept. Then they came out, opened the gates, and signaled the fleet, and then Troy was simply over. The city that had held for 10 years fell in a single night. King Priam was murdered at the altar. Hector's infant son was thrown from the walls. The women were divided as prizes. The Greeks won, but the gods were watching how they behaved in victory. Ajax violated Cassandra inside Athena's temple. Agamemnon took Cassandra as his prize. Athena, who had backed the Greeks throughout, turned against them. She convinced Zeus and Poseidon to send devastating storms against the returning fleet. Agamemnon made it home to Mycenae, where his wife Clytemnestra had spent 10 years waiting and planning. She had never forgiven him for Iphigenia. She killed him in his bath on the night he returned. Ajax was shipwrecked and drowned. Menelaus was blown off course to Egypt, and Odysseus' journey took 10 more years. Paris is already dead at this point, if you were wondering. He was wounded before the city fell. Helen ended up back in Sparta with Menelaus, and ancient sources are split on how to read that. Homer presents her as complex and aware of the destruction her situation caused. The Trojan War is not a story about good versus evil. Troy is not villainous and Greece is not righteous. Hector is more admirable than most Greek heroes. Helen is a victim of forces beyond her control. The gods are petty. The causes are not worth the cost. The Iliad's opening line asks the muse to tell of the rage of Achilles and all the grief it brought, not the glory, the grief. Looking at the war as a whole, we see that raw power never decides it. The cleverest solution ends it. Odysseus' horse succeeds where 10 years of fighting failed. Intelligence wins when strength cannot. The other major theme is what happens when you have been gone too long. Odysseus left for Troy 20 years before he returned. His son was an infant. When he comes back, everything has changed. The question the Greeks asked is whether you can reclaim what you left. The answer they gave is complicated. Yes, but only through violence, and it will cost you things you did not expect to lose. The man who returns is not the man who left. The home he returns to is not the home he left. The Trojan War has been the template for every homecoming narrative in Western literature for 3,000 years. Soldiers returning from war, travelers lost far from home. Anyone who has been away too long. The specific details of gods and heroes matter less than the structure. The journey that should be simple but becomes impossible. The obstacles that test more than strength. The homecoming that requires reclaiming rather than simply arriving. The Trojan War teaches us that the biggest conflicts almost never have proportionate causes. That the people who start wars and the people who fight them are rarely the same people. That the most admirable figures in a war can be found on both sides, while the least admirable often survive longest. And that winning a war is not the same as escaping its consequences. The Greeks took Troy, and then Athena sent the storms, and then the homecomings, and then the murders. The war was 10 years. The war's shadow lasted a generation. This video was created by combining human research and script writing with AI-assisted visual production, bringing these ancient stories to life for modern audiences. For more Greek mythology-related books and the AI tools we use to make this content, check the links in the description below.